In the summer of 2020, I matched with a woman named Claire on a dating app. Her profile was unassuming but intriguing, pictures of her hiking in the mountains, a candid shot of her laughing at a cafe, and a short bio that read, "Adventurer. Lover of campfires and good books. Let's get lost together." She seemed genuine, the kind of person who didn't need to try too hard to impress. We messaged back and forth for a week, sharing stories about travel and our favorite novels, before deciding to meet in person. She suggested something unconventional for a first date, a hike at a nature reserve about an hour outside the city. It was unusual, sure, but I admired her spontaneity. Besides, it was a public place, and I figured it would be safer than meeting at a random bar. I agreed, not realizing I'd just signed up for one of the most chilling nights of my life. We planned to meet at 4 p.m., giving us plenty of daylight to enjoy the hike. I arrived early, parking my car in the small gravel lot at the trailhead. The reserve was beautiful, with tall pines that stretched toward the sky and a soft breeze rustling through the leaves. The only other car in the lot was an old green station wagon, which I assumed belonged to another hiker. Claire arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of her car with a radiant smile. She was even more stunning in person, her auburn hair catching the sunlight and her hazel eyes sparkling with excitement. She was dressed in hiking boots, cargo pants, and a faded hoodie that made her look effortlessly adventurous. "Ready to go?" she asked, slinging a backpack over her shoulder. "Absolutely," I said, trying to match her enthusiasm. The first part of the hike was pleasant. The trail wound through dense forest, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds chirping in the distance. Claire was easy to talk to, her laughter infectious as we traded stories about our childhoods and embarrassing moments. She had a way of making me feel completely at ease, like we'd known each other for years. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. It started subtly. The birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on us. The air grew colder, and the sunlight dimmed as clouds rolled in overhead. Claire seemed to notice it too, her cheerful demeanor giving way to unease. "This place feels different," she said softly, her eyes scanning the trees. "Have you ever been here before?" "No," I admitted. "But it's probably just the weather." She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. We continued walking, the trail narrowing as it led us deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes that cast long, claw-like shadows on the ground. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, focusing instead on Claire's voice as she pointed out interesting plants and landmarks. Then we heard it, a faint whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. But the whispers had a rhythm, a cadence, as if they were words spoken in a language I couldn't understand. Claire froze, her hand gripping my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around us, weaving through the trees like an unseen presence. They were faint, but insistent, growing louder with each passing moment. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire didn't argue. We turned around, retracing our steps as quickly as we could. But the trail seemed different now, the twists and turns unfamiliar. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, reshaping its paths to keep us inside. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more distinct. I thought I could make out words, though they were jumbled and distorted, like a radio stuck between stations. The trees around us seemed to close in, their branches forming a labyrinth of shadows that blocked out the fading light. "We're lost," Claire said, panic creeping into her voice. "No, we're not," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We just need to keep moving." As we stumbled through the woods, we came across something that made my blood run cold, a clearing with a single wooden structure in the center. It was a small, weathered cabin, its roof sagging and its windows dark. The whispers seemed to converge here, swirling around the clearing like a storm. "We should keep going," Claire said, her voice trembling. But before we could take another step, the door of the cabin creaked open. A figure stepped out, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He wore a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak, he just stood there, watching us. Claire grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely audible. The man tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then he raised one hand and pointed toward the trail. We didn't wait to see what he wanted. We ran, the whispers rising to a deafening roar as we fled the clearing. The forest seemed alive now, its branches reaching for us like grasping hands. I stumbled more than once, but Claire pulled me to my feet each time, her strength keeping me going. When we finally reached the parking lot, it was empty. The green station wagon was gone, and so was Claire's car. What the hell is going on? I shouted, panic overtaking me. Claire didn't answer. She was staring at the forest, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. He's still watching, she said, her voice hollow. I turned to look, and there he was, standing at the edge of the trees. His glowing eyes locked onto mine as the whispers echoed in my ears. I don't remember driving home that night. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my bed, the events of the previous evening playing in my mind like a bad dream. But when I checked my phone, Claire's number was gone, and her profile had disappeared from the app. I went back to the nature reserve a week later, hoping to find some answers. The trailhead was the same, but the path we'd taken was overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. And the clearing with the cabin? It didn't exist. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was in that forest, or what happened to Claire. But every time I go hiking, I can't help but listen for the whispers and wonder if they're waiting for me to return. In the spring of 2019, I matched with a woman named Samantha on a dating app. She had a bright smile in her photos, the kind that made you feel warm just looking at it, and her profile radiated positivity. She was into hiking, yoga, and photography, all things I admired but rarely found the motivation to do myself. She suggested a quiet dinner at a small, rustic Italian restaurant downtown for our first date, and I readily agreed. When the evening arrived, I was early, as I tend to be when I'm nervous. The restaurant was cozy, with dim lighting and soft music that created an intimate atmosphere. I was seated at a corner table, anxiously scrolling through my phone, when Samantha walked in. She was stunning in person, tall, with dark, wavy hair and an effortless confidence that filled the room. She smiled when she saw me, and all my nerves seemed to evaporate. "Alex, right?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from me. "That's me," I replied, returning her smile. The first hour flew by. Samantha was smart, funny, and engaging. She talked about her recent trip to Ireland, her plans to start her own business, and her love for old horror movies. I was captivated. But as the conversation deepened, I started to notice something odd. Every so often, her eyes would flicker away from mine, darting to a spot just over my shoulder. At first, I thought she was just distracted by the movement in the restaurant, but it happened so often that I finally had to ask. "Is everything okay?" I said, turning to look behind me. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Yeah, sorry. I just thought I saw someone I knew." Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it, a slight tremor that made me uneasy. I let it go, chalking it up to first date jitters. But as the evening wore on, her behavior grew stranger. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on something across the room. Her face went pale, and for a moment, it looked like she wasn't even breathing. "Samantha," I said, leaning forward. "You're scaring me." She blinked, snapping out of whatever trance she'd fallen into. "Sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just nothing. I'm fine." After dinner, she suggested we take a walk to a nearby park. It was a clear, crisp night, and the city lights reflected off the still surface of the pond. The path was lined with trees, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows under the dim glow of the street lamps. For the first time all evening, Samantha seemed at ease. She laughed and joked, telling me stories about her childhood and her plans for the future. I was starting to think I'd imagined her earlier tension when she suddenly stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. I listened, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first, I heard nothing but the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then, faintly, I caught it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on gravel. "It's probably just another couple," I said, trying to reassure her. She shook her head. "No. It's him." My stomach tightened. "Him? Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and pulled me off the path, into the shadows of the trees. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and the fear in her eyes was palpable. "I need you to trust me," she said, her voice barely audible. "If I say run, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back." Before I could respond, the tapping grew louder. It was slow, deliberate, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. Samantha pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for me to stay quiet, and peeked out from behind the tree. Her face went white. "He's here," she whispered. I followed her gaze, and my heart dropped. At the edge of the path, illuminated by the pale light of the street lamps, stood a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak, he just stood there, watching. "Who is he?" I whispered. Samantha shook her head. "I don't know. He's been following me for weeks." The man tilted his head, as if he'd heard her. Then, slowly, he began to walk toward us. "Run," Samantha said, her voice trembling. "Now." We bolted, sprinting through the trees, the branches clawing at our clothes and skin. The tapping of his footsteps followed, growing louder and faster with every second. When we finally reached the edge of the park, we didn't stop. We ran through the streets, dodging cars and pedestrians, until we reached a small diner that was still open. We burst inside, gasping for breath, and slumped into a booth near the back. The waitress gave us a strange look but didn't ask any questions. Samantha stared out the window, her eyes darting back and forth as if she expected him to appear at any moment. "Who is he?" I asked again, more forcefully this time. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. "I don't know," she said finally. "I met him a few weeks ago at a coffee shop. He seemed normal at first, but then he started showing up everywhere, outside my apartment, at the grocery store, even at my gym. I tried to report it, but..." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "He's not normal." We stayed at the diner until dawn, too afraid to leave. When we finally stepped outside, the streets were quiet, the city bathed in the soft light of morning. There was no sign of the men, no sound of footsteps, no shadows lurking in the corners. Samantha insisted on taking a cab home, and I offered to follow her to make sure she was safe. But when I called her the next day, her phone was disconnected. Her profile on the dating app was gone, and when I went back to the park, there was no trace of her. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was, or what he wanted with Samantha. But every so often, I hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, and I feel the same cold dread I felt that night. And I wonder if he's found someone else to follow. It was late fall, 2020, when I matched with Charlotte on a dating app. Her profile was polished yet personal, the perfect blend of casual and mysterious. Her photos showcased her love of the outdoors, hiking, kayaking, and stargazing. Her bio: seeking someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty in life. It was intriguing and vague enough to draw me in. I was coming out of a rough breakup and looking for something light. Charlotte seemed like the perfect distraction. We messaged back and forth for a few days, and she suggested meeting up at a quiet bar on the outskirts of the city. I liked her directness, she seemed confident, grounded. Or so I thought. The bar she picked was a dive called the Hummingbird. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, dimly lit with a worn sign barely hanging onto the building, but it had a cozy, intimate vibe inside. Low lighting, old leather booths, and faint jazz music playing in the background made it feel timeless. Charlotte was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the corner. She was even more stunning in person, long dark hair that curled at the ends, piercing green eyes, and a smile that was equal parts inviting and mischievous. "You must be Alex," she said, standing to greet me. Her voice was soft but confident, with a slight southern lilt. I felt instantly at ease, though I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It was subtle, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire's been put out. We ordered drinks, whiskey for her, a beer for me, and started talking. Charlotte was captivating, effortlessly steering the conversation from light topics like travel and favorite movies to deeper, more personal questions. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel exposed, like she was peeling back layers I didn't even know I had. As the night wore on, I noticed something odd. Every so often, she would glance over my shoulder, her smile fading for just a moment. It was quick, subtle, but it happened enough times that I finally had to ask. "Everything okay?" I said, turning to look behind me. The bar was half full, the usual mix of regulars and randoms, but nothing seemed out of place. "Yeah," she said quickly, her smile returning. "I guess I'm just a little jumpy tonight. Long week." By midnight, the bar was nearly empty. The bartender was starting to clean up, and the soft hum of conversation had dwindled to a comfortable silence. Charlotte leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" she asked. It was such an odd question that I laughed. "Not really. Why? Her expression didn't change. I do. A lot. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I said the first thing that came to mind. Maybe it's just your imagination. Maybe, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She finished her drink and glanced at the clock on the wall. Do you mind walking me to my car? It's parked in the back. Of course, I said, eager to end the night on a chivalrous note. The back lot was dimly lit, with just a single flickering street lamp casting weak light over the rows of cars. Charlotte's car, an old Jeep, was parked at the far end, partially obscured by shadows. As we walked, the uneasy feeling from earlier returned, stronger now. The lot was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. Thanks for walking me, Charlotte said as we reached her car. She paused, her hand on the door handle, and turned to face me. You should leave quickly. Don't look back. What? I asked, confused. She didn't answer, just got into her car and drove off without another word. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps on gravel, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I didn't see anything. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that billowed slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his gaze, sharp and cold, cutting through the distance between us. I froze, unsure of what to do. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching. I forced myself to turn away and walk back to my car, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. The footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. When I looked back, the man was gone. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the road was empty. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and stayed up until dawn, too afraid to sleep. I never heard from Charlotte again. Her profile disappeared from the app the next day, and when I went back to the Hummingbird a week later, the bartender claimed he didn't remember her. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that same oppressive silence, that same cold gaze on the back of my neck. And I wonder if the man in the lot is still out there, waiting for me to turn around.